Hello, this is Nighthawk. Welcome to History Hack. In fact, welcome to the first installment of our special Friday show, which is Polish Picks. The premise behind this is Alina, in case you hadn't noticed by her impossible to pronounce surname, is Polish, and she has so many contacts, and we have so many esteemed Polish historians lining up to talk to us that we thought, what the hell, we'll go a little bit highbrow, and on a Friday afternoon, we will bring you a little bit of specifically English language, but Polish-focused history. And the response so far to this idea has been great. Alina, who is going to join us first off?
So our first guest I'd like to introduce to you for our special Polish segment is Dr. Pavel Markiewicz. He's from Boston, now residing in Warsaw, Poland. He's currently working on having his PhD thesis published on the German-Ukrainian collaboration in the general government during the Second World War. Look, having read the paper, I'm actually really looking forward to the published copy, so I can't wait. And our listeners will be happy to know that his work will be published in English. So, Pavel, welcome on our podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi, how are you? So you are in Warsaw now, aren't you? And like Alina, you're one of these people that flew in from elsewhere. So the Polish government have essentially put you under house arrest for 2 weeks. But apparently you had a complete nightmare getting back from, was it Washington you came in from?
I was in Washington, D.C. with my work, and then they decided to evacuate me. So I had to actually fly from Washington, D.C. to Miami, Florida, to catch a Polish plane there to fly back to Warsaw.
Wow. And now you're not allowed out. Are the police checking on you every day like they are with Alina, or is that just Alina because she's trouble?
No, you know what? I had my first police visit this morning, actually.
They've obviously got Alina marked as some source of potential civil unrest or trouble, or they're keeping an especial eye on her, which frankly, I'm not surprised. So enough about this virus. We keep talking about it because it's why we're here, because we're trying to entertain people through it. But let's start the ball rolling on your fascinating topic. So first of all, tell me, a complete layman and someone who has no specialism in Polish history, tell me a little bit about Ukrainian life pre-World War II in Poland.
Sure. I think the best way to kind of describe how it was the relations were pretty complex within the Second Polish Republic. Ukrainians constituted the largest ethnic minority within the Republic once the borders were constituted after 1921. And the Polish governments, depending on the time frame, had various approaches how to kind of assimilate the Ukrainians into Poland. Some of the governments chose what's called the national assimilation approach, where they tried to forcibly Polonize them as quickly as possible through education, to make them Poles almost overnight, one can say. After 1926, when Marshal Piłsudski had his coup to overthrow the previous governments, and then his pro-governments that supported him were in place, there was a different approach, which was assimilation through the state, where his government sought to kind of gain Ukrainian loyalty to the Polish state, not exactly to being ethnically Polish. So it kind of vacillated in between those areas. And I mean, Ukrainian life was constituted in the southeastern parts of Poland for the most part. And you had a whole array of political parties. You had leftist parties, you had more centrist parties. There were also the radical Ukrainian Nationalists, who were probably the most vociferous when it came to being anti-state. They saw being within the borders of Poland as being under a foreign power. Right? Their goal was, after World War I, throughout the interwar period, and even during World War II, to fight for an independent Ukrainian state that would emerge, a Ukraine for Ukrainians almost. So that's kind of the gist of how the situation looked before the war.
I mean, I had literally no idea that they were, like, as you say, the biggest ethnic minority within Poland. So this is all fascinating for me. Alina, you carry it on from here, because I fully admit I'm topic.
Well, well, as Pavel and I know, the history, and probably some of our listeners know, that the history does get quite complex. I actually spent time reading Pavel's work over the past couple of days. And in his work, he actually mentions a gentleman, a Ukrainian Polish gentleman called Volodymyr Kubiowicz. And he actually quite fascinated me, his whole ideology and things. And I was kind of hoping you'd tell us more about him and you know, basically just how fascinating this guy actually is.
Yeah, I mean, I chose Kubiowicz because I think he's an example of kind of the complexity of the Polish-Ukrainian relationship during the interwar period at the time, right? He was born into a family where his father was Ukrainian, his mother was Polish, his father was Greek Catholic, his mother was Roman Catholic. This was very common, of course, in interwar Poland, and even before that, where you'd have these inter-ethnic, inter-ritual marriages. As was common in those kinds of families, usually the sons would follow the father's footsteps, meaning that they'd be raised in the Greek Catholic rite. They'd usually follow kind of the Ukrainian side, while daughters would follow the mother's side, the Polish Roman Catholic side. So keeping in that kind of sense, Kubiowicz went in the direction of his father. He kind of had this Ukrainian awakening and identified himself at a very early age as Ukrainian and not Polish. Reading his memoirs, which were published in 1970 and then in 1985, shortly before he passed away, he mentions that he respected his mother, he loved his mother, he had no issues with her, that she was Polish. And I think he even says that it kind of helped him to better understand the other side as well, right, as he was growing up. So it kind of helped him mitigate the situation as best as he could, growing up in a dual ethnic family, so to speak.
So reading more about him, I came across an interesting question that I actually really want to ask you about. It's to do with Mihailo Hrushchevich. Oh my gosh, I'm really sorry.
Do what we do in England. This is the English side of you, Alina. Just do what we do and just call him Dave if it's too much of a struggle.
So Dave Hrushchevsky, right? We're going to go down this road. Sorry, it's just for me. I've written it out phonetically in Polish, and I still haven't gotten the name right. So he actually wrote a multi-volume history of Ukraine. I'm really apologizing. A multi-volume history of Ukraine and Russia, and apparently he read it when he was 13. Kubiowicz. My question is, how do you think that actually influenced him in his decisions, in his future decisions?
Well, I think reading Hrushchevsky's epic multi-volume history of Ukraine and Kievan Rus was very instrumental. But I think it's not just that. It kind of alludes back to what he was talking about, what he wrote about actually in his memoirs when he was younger and growing up. He said that there were always books in the home, right? It was something that he did with his parents quite often, as they'd sit and read. So he not only read Ukrainian authors or Ukrainian books that came in via his father, but he also said that he read a lot of the epic Polish novels that were written by Sienkiewicz, for example, Fire and Sword, The Deluge, all those kinds of classics from his mother's side as well. But I think that reading the history of Ukraine by Hrushchevsky had an impact on him because it gave him an idea of what Ukraine was, right? The history that Hrushchevsky wrote tells the story. It was one of the first modern historical epics written on the history of Ukraine, from Kievan Rus all the way to, I believe, the 18th century. And it kind of gives this idea of what Ukraine is, what it was, where its borders ran, which is very important as well, right? And that kind of molded, in my opinion, much of his later beliefs when he became a geographer and when he started to delineate his idea of what Ukraine looked like.
And just asking you, so I did a bit of reading as well. the Poles, were they really critical of him in the mid 1930s? And if so, why is that?
They were. Kubiowicz essentially received a doctorate at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow in geography, right? And anthropological geography as well. He did a lot of studies on mountain ranges in southeastern Poland and things along those lines. But when he started to get more attention from Poles was when he started publishing materials on the statistical data of Ukrainians in the Second Polish Republic. And much of his studies contradicted the official government statistics data, the official government line, that there weren't as many Ukrainians in Poland as, for example, Kubiowicz would say that they were. And this got him in a lot of hot water, actually. He was looked down upon in some of the Polish press. His articles were criticized. He was criticized. Even the Jagiellonian University was criticized for employing him. And what came of that was that in June 1939, he was essentially terminated from the university for that kind of work. So just about a few months before the outbreak of war, he lost his job.
Alina,
am I actually right? Sorry,
yeah.
Go on, Alex.
No, I was going to say, I think you're on it, because you told me something that you think is quite controversial, and you're going to ask Pavel, aren't you?
I am actually. We were discussing this before we actually started the podcast. I mentioned this to Alex. Am I actually right in hearing that the Ukrainian government is going to actually honour him? Is this true?
That's correct. The Ukrainian parliament recently passed a resolution to honor certain individuals this year, and Kubiowicz is actually one of them, because this year marks the 120th anniversary of his birth, as he was born in 1900, a nice round year. So they are honoring him for his work as a scholar, geographer, and things along those lines.
So listen, let's move on a little bit into the Second World War. I mean, that's what we're here for.
Right.
And I actually threw this question at Alex, but I'm going to get Alex to ask this question, sorry.
Yeah, because I don't get this at all, and I need you to spell it out in layman terms for me. So I keep hearing about this this concept of German-Ukrainian common destiny. Can you explain to me like what that is and how it comes about?
Well, I think the common destiny really was centered in the nationalist approach to creating some kind of an autonomous region or state with the Germans, and being the Germans' bulwark in the East against anything communist, Soviet, Bolshevik, right? That's kind of where that lays in.
As we're on the topic of kind of towards the Second World War, for our listeners out there who aren't World War II knowledgeable or don't know much about Poland, the general governor of occupied Poland was Hans Frank, and I was actually quite interested in the whole stance, his stance on the Poles and the Ukrainians. Pavel, can you elaborate a little bit on this for me?
Sure. Obviously, when the general government was created from the parts of central Poland that weren't directly annexed into the Third Reich, the Germans were met with a large Polish population, as well as a sizable Ukrainian population within the eastern and southeastern parts of the general government. Now, added to that, about 20 to 30,000 Ukrainians actually fled from those territories that were occupied by the Soviets in 1939, right? So that influx of a very intellectual, well-organized, we could say emigre community into the general government also added to the mix. Now, Frank's policy was the kind of classic approach of dividing and conquering among these certain ethnic groups, right? So what we see is that in the hierarchy that was formed by the German officials, Jews and Poles were at the bottom, Of course, Germans, Volksdeutsche were at the top, and kind of sandwiched in between were Ukrainians, who had a little more leeway, for example, than Poles, but not as much as the Volksdeutsche or the ethnic Germans that were in the general government. Much of Frank's policy was to flirt with the Ukrainians, to kind of flirt with their aspirations, to give them a little bit of what the Polish state didn't want to give them during the interwar period, to gain their loyalty without giving up much in return. That was most of what his politics were based on. To gain the Ukrainian loyalty as an added lever to neutralize Poles as well, right? Because we have to remember that as much as the Germans' administration was in Poland, they were still in a vast minority in the general government in comparison to Poles, right? So by cutting away Ukrainians from the Polish mass, gaining their loyalty through certain concessions, social concessions, Frank wanted to use them as a lever also against the Poles when he could. To kind of even, let me just add, to kind of keep the ethnic antagonism that was going on before the war still going on, but in a way that the Germans could control it, right?
I just wanted to ask, can you give us some examples of these kinds of concessions, if possible?
No, absolutely. I think the Germans were very clever in that they went with, as I said, a lot of the concessions that they gave came from simply what the Poles didn't want to or marginalize Ukrainians in. For example, they allowed the Ukrainians to create schools, a school system within the general government in the areas that they inhabited. Elementary schools, gymnasiums, vocational schools. During the interwar period, at a certain time, these Ukrainian language schools or Ukrainian schools were marginalized, right? They were turned into virtually dual language Polish-Ukrainian schools, which meant they were in essence Polish schools. So there was this educational concession. There was a religious concession as well, especially in parts of the Lublin district, where the Orthodox Church before the war was heavily criticized. And in fact, there was an anti-Orthodox kind of operation by the Polish government in which church property was seized and given to the Roman Catholic Church. So the Germans came and they started reversing this trend, giving those churches back that were seized back to the Ukrainians, making a big show out of it, making them feel that they were in fact doing something for them. There was a Ukrainian press that ran from 1939, from 1940 to the end of the war in the general government. The Ukrainian cooperatives, they were allowed to flourish again. So these were, like I said, these were social concessions. They were pretty straightforward in that the Germans pretty much allowed the built-up angst that Ukrainian nationalists had to vent out through this system of social concessions, but it didn't get out of control, right? They were able to mitigate it.
How did Poles react?
It was mixed. Pretty much until about 1941, the Polish underground looked on, and there were certain types of attacks against some of the more prominent Ukrainians in villages or in towns. But these attacks increased after about 1943, when the occupation system was starting to fall apart, and when the underground government mitigated orders saying that any traitors to the Polish state would be dealt with. And of course, traitors was kind of a far-reaching term for however one wanted to define it. And there were more attacks against these prominent Ukrainians.
So going back to Kubiowicz, what did he want to achieve through his cooperation with the Germans?
Well, I think one of the main things that he sought to achieve was to kind of pull the Ukrainians up to a social level that was equal to what the Poles were at the interwar period, right? He wanted to build up that social base of an intelligentsia, a kind of religious class, a merchant class, And that, I think, was figured into this kind of greater nationalist vision of preparing for some kind of a future Ukrainian state, a future Ukrainian region, autonomous region, so on and so forth. And that's pretty key because on numerous occasions, Kubievich was also very vocal with the German authorities of ethnically cleansing mixed areas where Poles and Ukrainians lived on territory that he considered to be part of the future or part of ethnographic Ukraine, right? He was very vocal in this. He wanted the German hand kind of to set the stage for what would eventually be, or what could eventually be, territory that would be included in a Ukrainian state. So this all lay in his kind of geographic vision of what Ukraine would be, wouldn't be, and he tied himself to cooperating with the Germans to get the most that he could out of them for the Ukrainian cause, right? Now, that didn't mean that he always got what he wanted. Ukrainians were also arrested. They were rounded up. They were sent to camps. It wasn't that they were simply treated better all the time. But through his efforts, Kubievich sought to gain the best that he could for them throughout the war, and to leverage that as best as he could for the future.
Pavel, thank you so much for joining us. Alina mentioned that your PhD is going to be published as well. Do you know when that will be yet?
Well, I'm still in the process of revising the text and preparing a draft manuscript, so it might be a little bit, but stay tuned.
Well, it's not like you don't have time on your hands now, is it? But make me a promise.
That's true.
Make me a promise. Let us know when it's done, and we will plug it on History Hack and tell people where they can get it.
Definitely.
Awesome. Alina, I'm really excited about our little Polish pick now. I don't know about you.
I know, right? There's some really great historians coming on board, and I'm doing lots of reading that's actually helping with my own research. So I'm kind of being a little bit selfish at the moment. Sorry.
Yeah, I haven't done any of my own research, so yeah, I'm not bitter at all. But okay, anyway, Pavel, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. Next week for our Polish... Awesome, and good luck getting out of quarantine. Although I understand you guys, isn't the Polish government locking everybody down now?
I think that, yeah, I think they've, said to anybody that can stay home, stay home.
I think I've just broken you, haven't you? I've just told you basically that you're under house arrest indefinitely and you didn't know.
What? Maybe.
They've brought in some new things last night, basically, where you should only really be going to work if you have to. You can go out and walk the dog, go shopping, go to the pharmacy. So we're kind of all stuck at home, just like everyone else.
Which means that we can have another Polish pick next week. And I'm really excited because even I've heard of this guest. So Sławomir Dębski, the director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs and a renowned and brilliant historian, is going to join us. Now, we're going to set up a Q&A. Broadly speaking, at the moment, we're just finalising the exact title now, but it's going to be about the relationship between Russia and Poland historically and coming into now. But we will put out on the Twitter feed as soon as we know exactly what he's going to talk about, and we will welcome your questions for him. So that is it for this week. We hope you've enjoyed it. We've hoped that you have enjoyed a little bit of a specialist angle and something a little bit more serious than what we usually do. And for now, it's goodbye from me and goodbye from Alina as well. Remember, stay safe, and if you can possibly, stay at home, and we'll see you again next week. This is Nighthawk, over and out.